Welcome to a new episode of Compleetdenkers with Geert Vanden Bossche. Welcome back, Geert. You were with us almost 1 year ago, and we thought it was a good idea to invite you once more to first of all look back at the last year. Maybe first question: how are you?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me again. I'm fine, I think. It has been a very rough ride, but I have the luxury that I find rest and peace with my family, which helps me a lot. Nobody's vaccinated. We don't have these discussions about, these tensions that many families experience. So when I get to work on the COVID crisis, I can be very concentrated. And then when I'm with my family, I can relax. I think all in all, it brought family and new friends together, which is a very important compensation for the stress that many of us have experienced over the last 2-3 years.
But you see it. I see it. You are much more calm and than last year, because I remember when we had our first chat episode with you. You told me that you slept only 2 hours because you were working at a new paper, and now you seem to be much more relaxed.
Yeah, it's maybe a little bit misleading, because I've been very much stressed as well to write the book that I just finished, because I thought that what I was predicting could maybe happen before I finished the book. So I've been really also working almost, well, day and night is exaggerated, but certainly all weekends, all days during the week to finish the book. And now that it is finished, I have decided to really take a break, where I will continue to do interviews and follow things, but it's less proactive, let's say. I will reply to demands, but I will be less proactive in initiating things myself.
No, maybe we will directly look at the book, but maybe first look at the episode last year, because you gave a warning about what could possibly happen with society. You were afraid that certain things could happen, but we have to say, luckily, for now at least, last months were not that bad. Or do you see that otherwise?
Yeah, well, I've been also being very vocal, I would say, on why I have been, not wrong with regard to my predictions, but with regard to the timeline of my predictions. And it's only after I took a deep dive in better understanding how the virus interacts with the immune system that I finally got to understand that, in fact, the immune system had an opportunity to catch up to some extent to the virus, because the virus is evolving much faster than the immune system can adapt to the situation. But nevertheless, with the advent of Omicron, the immune system had an opportunity to catch up to some extent, which has delayed, in fact, my predictions. That is one thing. The other thing is that the current situation is extremely misleading, and I continue to pretend that what we are experiencing right now is the silence before the tsunami. Because, first of all, when we start with the unvaccinated have now experienced a lot of exposures to many, many different variants. In most people who are in good health and who have been living more or less a normal life, have not been, locking themselves up in a kind of concrete bunker. These people have been exposed so many times to all these variants that their natural immunity is so well trained that I'm convinced that the unvaccinated who are in good health will no longer suffer from any kind of coronavirus illness, SARS-CoV-2 illness. So the unvaccinated, they started off in a less favorable situation, because remember, at the beginning of the vaccination, those that were best protected against disease were the vaccinated. And the unvaccinated got, more frequently the disease. But as the virus evolved, as the immune system evolved, this balance has now changed. One must say, however, that there is still an immune mechanism that almost nobody understands that is still protecting the vaccinated people as well, that is protecting them from severe disease, that is even protecting them from disease. Many of the vaccinated people that I know right now, in terms of COVID, we are not talking about other diseases like influenza, like other secondary diseases that they may get because of maybe some immune suppression, but in terms of COVID, most of them are doing pretty well as well. So there is the frequency of disease has diminished, even hospitalizations have diminished, etc., amongst the vaccinees. And I've been studying this immune mechanism, the immune mechanism by which vaccinees are now protected against severe disease and disease, which is very unusual because, first of all, we all know the neutralizing antibodies do no longer work. The virus has become resistant to the neutralizing antibodies. That is kind of amazing because we know that for all those viral diseases that are, according to the textbook, acute self-limiting, that means you get the virus, you get the infection, the disease, but at some time you clear the virus. You eliminate the virus from your body, it's completely eliminated, you recover from the disease, you get your immunity, etc. For this type of diseases, normally neutralizing antibodies protect you, and that is sufficient. And all of the vaccines that target acute self-limiting viral infections are based on neutralizing antibodies, but they are prophylactic. So you have the neutralizing antibodies before you get exposed, and then the neutralizing antibodies catch the virus, neutralize it, and you don't get the disease. Now we have a situation where this mechanism does no longer work. The virus, the Omicron descendants that are circulating right now, are resistant to the neutralizing antibodies. That is one thing. On the other hand, the virus has become more infectious. So the infection rates that we read right now, that we get to see in the statistics, etc., are tremendously underestimated because there is much less testing, because also symptoms are milder, there is less need for testing, etc. And but infection rates are high. The virus is still very infectious. The neutralizing antibodies do no longer protect. Nevertheless, we see that these vaccinees who are having these antibodies that are no longer protecting are still protected, not only against severe disease, but even against disease. And so
do you think that the vaccinated persons should get tested more than, or isn't that what you're saying?
No, I'm not giving a recommendation. I'm just trying to explain why the situation right now is so insidious and misleading. Mm-hmm. First of all, the unvaccinated are better and better protected, but also the vaccinees are pretty well protected as far as COVID-19 is concerned, against severe disease and even against disease. But what I'm saying and what I'm explaining, I have explained this before, I've explained this again in my book, is that this type of immunity of the vaccinees is very fragile, that it will be temporary, short-lived, that it will be overcome by the virus. It cannot tame the virus sufficiently to prevent the virus from further developing and evolving to ultimately overcome this weak type of immunity. But as long as this doesn't happen, as long as this more virulent variant is not emerging, yes, we are dealing with a situation that is very unusual, unprecedented, never ever described before in biology or during pandemics, where we have a situation where the vaccinees are protected against severe disease, against disease. The same for the unvaccinated, but let's be very clear. These two immune mechanisms by which the vaccinees and the unvaccinated are protected are completely different. And the unvaccinated are protected by training because of continuous exposure to the variants. That is a durable immunity, very robust. Since this is to a large extent based on innate immunity, it's also non-variant specific. Mm-hmm. It can deal with all the different variants. The immunity that the vaccinated people need to rely on is very fragile. It will be temporary and it will be overcome by the virus. So that is a very fragile situation, and that will change in future. But as long as this is not the case, we are dealing now in society with a situation where there is fewer cases, where also, of course, the measures have been relaxed, and people think we are getting back to a more or less normal situation. Our health officials are even pretending that the virus is now in the process of transitioning to endemicity, because we would, so to say, have herd immunity, which is a complete nonsense, because one of the typical features of herd immunity is that you diminish the infection rate in the population, which is not at all the case, as I was just saying. So the situation right now is completely misleading, and certainly if people don't understand, which is for me the biggest gap in the misunderstanding and the misinterpretation of the pandemic, is that there is an enormous gap in the knowledge, in the immunology. The immunology behind this pandemic is not understood. And if you don't understand the underlying immunological drivers for the immune escape, etc., and you just look, like our experts are doing, at what is happening right now in society, then you see, yes, the rate of hospitalization is decreasing, infection rates are, pretty normal because they are largely underestimated, and there is, very few vaccinees who die or who develop severe disease due to COVID. Let's be very clear. And due to COVID-19, we know that there are more hospitalizations because of other diseases that to a large extent are most likely indirectly induced by the vaccination because of immune suppression and all these type of things. But in terms of COVID-19, so it's pretty calm. And that is what I'm calling the calm, the silence before the tsunami. Because if you look at what the virus is doing, the virus continues to evolve like hell. And there are peer-reviewed journals of, mutation spotters who are clearly saying in peer-reviewed journals that this situation is alarming. Because what no health official will tell you is where this is going. If things are dramatically evolving, it's important to know, is this going into a very benign direction where ultimately the immunity of the population will control the virus? This is beyond unlikely because there is no herd immunity, as I was saying. Or is this virus maybe now struggling to overcome the immune pressure that the population is putting on the virus, which we know is too weak to control the virus? And if that is the case, which I'm completely convinced of, and I think I have brought together sufficient arguments in my book to unambiguously demonstrate that this is the case, then the situation is the threat is imminent. And it's a very, very worrisome situation. It's not obvious clinically, if you like, and that is why I'm saying that society in highly vaccinated countries, not in Africa, will be caught by surprise.
And in other parts in the world where they use a different type of vaccine, does it make a change or not?
Well, this is also one of the questions I've been dealing with very extensively in my book. That is, we can elaborate on this more in detail, but in a nutshell, I've shown, and in my book, that there is a high likelihood, for me, it's scientifically so convincing that for me it is certain that especially the mRNA vaccines are expediting or accelerating the immune escape much more than the other vaccines.
So that's Pfizer and Moderna. Eh?
It's Pfizer and Moderna, yeah. But you know, since I'm not becoming personal or in my book, I'm just looking at this from a scientific viewpoint. Yes. That the mechanism by which the mRNA vaccines induce the in vivo synthesis of the protein is such that the immune system reacts to this in a different way as compared to when the S protein is produced as a subunit or a virus-like particle or an inactivated virus and is then injected into the body, where in fact the antigen is already existing in the formulation of the vaccine before you inject it, in contrast to the mRNA vaccines, where the factory, so to say, the human cell, the human body, because the spike protein, that is the antigen, is synthesized in the cell that got transduced, sorry, by the mRNA vaccine. So the mRNA vaccines are expediting the immune escape. But other populations or populations that have been vaccinated with other vaccines, so non-mRNA vaccines,
so the Russians and
you
China
will also have the immune escape, but it will not proceed at the same pace as in populations that have been vaccinated with mRNA vaccines.
So if you are right, then the biggest problems we will see in Europe, the United States of America, Australia, or
Israel, for example. Israel. Yeah, it's very clear that what I'm predicting is most likely going to become much more manifest and much more earlier in, first of all, countries that have been highly vaccinated, and especially in those that have almost exclusively been using mRNA vaccines.
And last year you made the same prediction. Do you now dare to put a date on it, or can it be like 2 months, or can it also take 2 more years before we see this happen?
Well, yeah, that is very difficult. I've been let me be very open about this. Of course, it's in theory, it's very, very difficult to predict this, because this thing, the evolution that we are seeing right now, has never happened before. I thought at the beginning that once the virus escapes, which has happened already with, you know, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, virus started already to escape. The biggest escape, the big bang, has happened with Omicron, where all of a sudden, puff, there were over 30 mutations in the spike protein that enabled Omicron to you know, largely escape to the neutralizing antibodies induced by the vaccine. So I thought initially that once the virus starts to escape, you know, I mean, when you escape and you get some advantage compared to, you know, the immune system chasing you, this advantage becomes bigger and bigger, and it's almost like, you know, has an exponential course. So I thought it would go very, very fast. This was at a time where I had not realized, I could not realize, nobody could realize this. Even up till today, people don't understand what happened. But with Omicron, you will remember that many vaccinees, despite being vaccinated, got the disease with Omicron, for example. Remember, you know, when we had Omicron, the vast majority of these highly vaccinated populations, or the populations where the mass vaccination was really pushed, were already to a large extent vaccinated. Nevertheless, many vaccinees, even young people, remember last summer, for example, got the disease, right? And so that is what we call vaccine breakthrough infections. So that means that despite being vaccinated, the virus breaks through the immunity conferred by the vaccine, and that has a dramatic consequence. This provokes a phenomenon that is very well known in vaccinology, but it has never been described during a pandemic, and it is called immune refocusing. So in very simple terms, because I'm still trying to respond to your question with regard to the prediction whether the situation has changed, etc. I'm trying to explain why the situation has only aggravated, but why my predictions in terms of the timeline were to some extent wrong, because I did not realize that when you have a vaccine breakthrough infection with Omicron, so in a vaccinated person, you induce a new type of immunity. In fact, I'm not going, it's all explained in my book, but I'm not going to go into the molecular detail. But what it comes down to is that a vaccine breakthrough infection forces the immune system to focus on other domains of the spike protein and will develop immunity to these other domains of the spike protein. To some extent, that is very interesting, because these other domains enable the immune system to induce cross-neutralization across several different variants. But the problem is that this immunity is very weak. So it will, at the beginning, it will induce neutralization, and the vaccinees that got Omicron, the immunity that they developed after having experienced an Omicron infection was almost like sterilizing. It was protecting against infection and certainly against disease. That is where many of our health officials were like saying Omicron is a blessing. Because, Omicron is not only causing mild disease, it is like a boost for the vaccines. Look, the people who got Omicron are now even protected against disease and even against productive infection. And so what they didn't realize, because they don't understand the mechanism of immune refocusing, is that the immune system reacts to domains that are only able to induce weak immunity. When you say weak immunity, you immediately know that it is easy for the virus to overcome. And you have seen, once Omicron appeared, within the few weeks and months thereafter, we had a panoply of subvariants of Omicron that were more infectious and that were able to escape the immunity that had been induced by these vaccine breakthrough infections. Why? Because that immunity was insufficient, was too weak. It was very spectacular at the beginning, but it waned very, very rapidly, giving the virus an enormous chance to even expedite the immune escape. But this period during which we had better protection because of the vaccine breakthrough infections, because of this initial immunity protected against productive infection and against disease, gave the immune system, so to say, a break, in a sense that the immune system could to some extent catch up, because if you can curtail productive infection, you will curtail transmission, and you will slow down, of course, the evolution of the virus. But so this is the reason why my predictions were, in fact, or the timeline, I largely, in fact, underestimated the timeline within which the more virulent variants would appear. I thought once the virus escapes, the immune system is lost. Seems like the immune system could still have this catch-up, maneuver, thanks to the vaccine breakthrough infections, and therefore the whole thing got now, in fact, delayed. But at the end of the day, what happened is that immune escape got only expedited. That's why we are seeing still, like, these very different variants that are derived from Omicron, for example, the BQ1, BB, etc. All these new variants coming up. And those are still further evolving, and you can see that in countries where XBB.1.5, etc. appear, they start to dominate and they start to supplant the other ones. So remains to be seen where this evolution is going to end, but it's very clear from my analysis that the further expansion of these variants is only putting more immune pressure on the virus, an immune pressure that is caused by the immune reaction that I was talking about just a few minutes ago, this weak immune response that prevents vaccinees from developing severe disease or even disease, that now the virus is working on to overcome this. So it's very, very, very complex. It's certainly not easy to understand. But I think the key message here is that people do realize that these interactions between the virus and the immune system are evolving. The virus is evolving. The immune system, we call this the adaptive immune system. The B cells, the T cells, are kind of like adapting to that situation. The virus again reacts to that. The more pressure you put, the more you try to defend yourself, the more the virus is going to become, so to say, inventive and will overcome this. And it is very important that people understand that this is something dynamic. It's not like our experts are saying, guys, this is the situation. And no, it's not. It's evolving all the time. What applies today does not necessarily apply tomorrow. This is evolving. It's very complex. It is a kind of balance that has been severely disturbed by human intervention, and that nature is trying to correct in, the best ways it can, but certainly trying to give the virus an opportunity to continue to survive for as long as possible. You can imagine if you have an immune response that all of a sudden fails completely, like I was predicting at the beginning, where I thought once the virus is escaping, the immune system can no longer catch up, and it will immediately lead to a dramatic situation. In that case, the virus could, so to say, kill large parts of the population, could no longer survive. As a matter of fact, what is happening is that nature is shaping these things in a way that immunity can catch up to some extent, so the virus will not be able to proceed very rapidly with, causing severe disease, etc., which leaves the virus an opportunity to replicate, because there is still the population, large parts of the population that are surviving. And so it can extend and prolong its survival and ensure its perpetuation, so to say. But of course, I think everybody needs to understand that this system has its limits. And we are now coming very close to the limits of this system, where the immune system will no longer be able to catch up, and the virus will simply break through it, right?
For vaccinated people.
For the vaccinated people, because as I was saying, this immunity that is now, so to say, protecting them, and where our health authorities are trying to make people believe that this is either a combination of you being a vaccinee, having been exposed to the virus, and or being vaccinated, what they call hybrid immunity, which is, sounds very, very sexy. Hybrid is always good. You get, both parts. You get the best of natural immunity. You get the best of the vaccine. So you guys should be in very, very good shape. But if you ask them, tell me, what are the components of this hybrid immunity? How exactly does that work? They cannot explain this because they do not understand the phenomenon of immune refocusing that was initially very beneficial. It even protected vaccinees again against productive infection, which was something that had already been lost before. But they do not realize that this temporary benefit ultimately allowed Omicron to accelerate the immune escape, and is now in fact leading to a situation that is much worse in terms of immune escape than the situation we had before. So this, so to say, hybrid immunity is very, very misleading. It is not a robust immunity, on the contrary, whereas the unvaccinated, they have gotten a difficult time at the beginning, and most of us got, the disease, and I'm always saying, and
even a couple of times. Yeah. I think I had it 3 or 4 times.
Absolutely, and I continue to say, what is happening right now is that with this expedited development of the variants, we have gotten a burden of variants like we never had before. Normally during, for example, influenza, every season you can have a new variant, etc. Your immune system catches up with this, you can get the disease, etc. But now we literally got one variant and still after the other. And this has been an enormous burden for the unvaccinated. But the miracle, this is really a miracle of nature. Your natural immunity can cope with this, can deal with this, even if it has to deal with a number of variants that are so numerous. You normally would not expect this number of variants to occur within 1, 2, or 3 years. You would expect those variants to occur within maybe 1,000 years. Nevertheless, your natural immunity can deal with this. And it's not because you get a disease and you are ill, that this is a sign or an indication that your immune system cannot deal with it. Because let's not forget, getting ill is normal. It's a normal phenomenon. Getting severely ill, having to be, if you need to be hospitalized, that is not normal. Dying from it is not normal. And that we got, several, as unvaccinated, several infections, maybe interspaced with just a few months. The cause of this is simply that, the highly vaccinated populations have been breeding a number of variants, unprecedented, never seen before, that started to dominate. And this has been an enormous burden for the unvaccinated. But the reward that they are getting right now is that this immune system is now so well armed against those variants, because what will happen, I'm also describing this in my book, is that the new variants that will evolve towards more virulent variants will not become more infectious. So the unvaccinated have already prepared their immune system, their natural immunity, for more infectious variants. If now the variant is becoming more virulent, that is not going to disturb the unvaccinated that trained their innate immunity, right? Of course, it will remain a problem for unvaccinated who have not been exposed to those variants. I think there is very few, but this would be typically because the variants were very infectious. So the likelihood that you got exposed as an unvaccinated, was very, very high. Even if you were trying to avoid contacts, etc., it's almost like impossible. So there are very, very few people who have not been exposed. But you see, for example, the situation in China. They have tried to isolate people, not getting any contact. And then all of a sudden, you start to diminish these infection prevention measures, to relax them. And as soon as they started this, within 1 week, you had already a bombshell, an explosion of infections. So that is how infectious the virus is, how difficult it is to prevent.
So according to you, it was a hell of a situation in China a few weeks ago.
Yeah, but it's already diminishing, right? They have to catch up on, people had not the opportunity, there are many people, to develop natural immunity, right? Which is a disaster, which is now really protecting us. I'm always saying, and I keep saying, people who are best protected against SARS-CoV-2 infection are the unvaccinated in highly vaccinated countries, because the highly vaccinated populations are breeding variants like hell. And so they circulate, and as an unvaccinated, you get exposed all the time. But this is so important. I said this from the very beginning, as an unvaccinated, do not avoid contact. Do not avoid contact, because it's important that your immune system keeps training, to cope with this more variants. And then the second thing, which is also key, is that you have to make sure that you keep in and you stay in good health. I'm always, giving the example of this weight lifter, right, who trains to lift this, let's say 100 kilogram. And then he has achieved this performance. He lifts this 100 kilogram above his head. But then, for example, one day he has a hangover. He got drunk, he didn't sleep. The next day, he cannot lift his 100 kilograms, despite the fact that he's completely trained. So it's the combination of getting trained through exposure and keeping yourself in good health. That combination is now making the natural immunity of unvaccinated people in highly vaccinated countries so powerful that they will no longer, they get still maybe infected, can maybe develop very superficial symptoms, but no way that they will still get, the typical COVID-19 symptoms, let alone that they would need hospitalization. No. It's important to understand this, and I must say, Stephen, if there is one thing that I would like, if somebody would ask me, Geert, summarize the biggest issue, the biggest blunder that has been made during this pandemic by, the decisions, especially of the WHO and our health authorities who blindly follow this, is that we have been completely, or they have been completely underestimating the enormous power and capacity of natural immunity. Remember, if you have a natural pandemic, 90% of the population have asymptomatic infection. How does that come? Nobody has seen the virus before. So the population is, so to say, immunologically naive. Nevertheless, 90% of the population has mild symptoms or asymptomatic, Where does this immunity come from? This can only be, innate immunity. And then once you have gotten the waves, 1, 2, 3 waves, you diminish the infection rate in the population, you completely control the virus, thanks to herd immunity. All this is due to natural immunity, which has been something that has been completely ignored, because once you start with vaccination, you do no longer stimulate the cell-based innate immunity. Cell-based innate immunity that can eliminate the virus at an early stage of infection. And you simply rely on adaptive immunity, which we knew already before Omicron, is not sufficient, because the antigen in the vaccine does no longer correspond to the antigen that is circulating on the variants. And now it's even becoming worse, because the adaptive immunity that is now built is no longer due to the vaccinal antibodies, as I was saying. The virus has become completely resistant to these antibodies, but it's due to another type of antibodies. I'm also describing this in my book, non-neutralizing antibodies, that provide the vaccinees with still some protection, but that is weak, that is fragile, that will be overcome by continued virus evolution, and that has nothing to do with robust, long-standing memory. Right, but as long as it is, present, so to say, most people, including our health officials, are under the impression that thanks to the vaccination and thanks to the exposure to the virus, we are now in the process of controlling this virus, having herd immunity. Whereas the bulk of the iceberg is under the water, so it's not seen by people, it's not seen by them because they don't understand, but it will surface one day. The question is not whether this will happen, The question is, to your point, when it will happen. And to give, a more concrete answer to your question, it's difficult to predict, because I'm convinced that the mutations that will drive the virus towards a higher level of virulence will no longer be driven by changes in the amino acids, that's the backbone of the spike protein, but it is now driven by, we call this glycosylation, is the addition of more sugars on the virus spike protein. Nobody's talking about these sugars, but you have to know that a large percentage of the surface of the spike protein, 40–50%, is covered by sugars. And it's documented, you will find this in every textbook of virology, that the sugars, the glycans, are so important with regard to immunity. You can imagine if you have a sugar chain that all of a sudden can shield a whole domain, for example, a whole domain of the virus, of the spike protein, and can, by doing that, by shielding it, by masking it, it can completely shield the virus from the immune response. So it's a very, very important phenomenon. And that is what is currently going on right now. How long it will take for this glycosylation to completely prevent or inhibit the kind of fragile immunity that is still in place in the vaccinees, that is difficult to say. But I cannot imagine, really, I cannot imagine that this would take another 2 years. It's difficult to say, but if it happens tomorrow in one of these highly vaccinated countries, especially, as I was saying, vaccinated with mRNA vaccines, I would not be surprised. If it would only occur within 1 year, for example, I would be very, very much surprised. But I remain convinced that no matter what, society in highly vaccinated countries will be caught by surprise. Nobody is expecting this, because if you don't understand the underlying immunology, there is no reason right now for panicking, as you were pointing out correctly. And, people feel better. Of course, there are like other problems now popping up. We hear about the avian flu. We hear about other diseases like incidence of cancer. We hear about excess mortality. We hear about side effects, etc.
What do you think about that, the excess mortality?
Well, yeah, I think that the excess mortality, first, not I think, this is a fact. I mean, it has now been documented in so many countries, in people who are really doing the right statistics and the right analysis. It's not like it's just happening in one country. It's a general phenomenon. We also know that, especially again, the mRNA vaccines are leading to immune inflammation, immune suppression. We hear about all this, even young people suffering from cardiac arrests or myocarditis, etc. We hear about, an explosion of turbo cancers, where all of a sudden people who had, their cancer more or less under control, it's again reactivated, and resurgence of these cases. We hear about chronic viral infections getting reactivated, etc. So all this is, of course, leading to a higher mortality rate. These are typically people who, would be hospitalized or even die not from COVID-19, but with COVID-19 or with SARS-CoV-2 that are positive, but are not dying directly from COVID-19 disease. This is already happening. What I'm predicting is that this will change in a situation where people will die, will be hospitalized from COVID-19 once the virus has turned into a more virulent form. Because then we have a situation, we know already that the virus is resistant to our antibody or to the to neutralizing antibodies. So this is similar to a situation where you have resistance to antibiotics. An antibody is an antibiotic, a natural antibiotic that is produced by your very own body. So it's very similar. We all know if you have resistance against antibiotics, that is not a very good thing. But on top, the enemy we are trying to fight is becoming or is more infectious. So are dealing with highly infectious variants that antibodies are no longer functioning against. And then this even becomes, as I was saying, most likely through this glycosylation, more virulent. Then you can imagine that you are dealing with a pretty catastrophic situation where things could go very, very fast. And that is my fear, that when this happens, our healthcare system will be completely overwhelmed, and that this could have a domino effect on other layers, of course, of society due to people, feeling insecure, panic breaking out. And I think some of our officials do not rule out that this could happen, even if they do not understand exactly what is happening. And I think that is the reason why some of them, it's just unbelievable, are still trying to do whatever they can to make vaccinees believe that there is still an advantage in being vaccinated. Because you can imagine, the more this excess mortality becomes evident, the more side effects become documented, and the more vaccinees see that people like we are no longer getting the disease, that we are doing fine, they start asking more and more questions. Was this worth doing all this? Getting jabbed 3, 4, 5 times with, colleagues of mine, family, relatives, dying at the age of, sometimes young, 40, 50 age, all of a sudden, gone, etc., excess mortality. If they do not continue to try whatever they can to convince the vaccinees that there was still an advantage of getting vaccinated and that therefore they should repeat this, then I think we have a big crisis, because if the vaccinees will realize that this was not the right thing to do,
But will they react, according to you?
I don't know, Stephen. But for me, it's the question. You can speculate, and you can try to imagine what would happen if now more and more vaccinees become convinced that this was a completely failure operation, that this was a complete blunder. It's difficult to imagine that this would not unchain a kind of revolution. But I think, I cannot prove this, but my gut feeling is that what I'm predicting will occur faster than, the emotions and the discussions that will come up, and even the political discussions and decisions that will come up in society as a consequence of people realizing that this was a complete failure operation.
If you are right, and it happens, for instance, if the new variant will occur in, let's say, Spain, are lockdowns then a good tool for the governments to prevent the new variant, which is in Spain, comes to Belgium? Or is that a stupid question?
No, that is not a stupid question. What will happen is that there will be panic, chaos. In such a situation, you can imagine that they will try to do what they have been trying to do at the beginning of the pandemic, where we were dealing, in fact, to be honest, with a pretty harmless virus. Mm-hmm. Of course, it had caused deaths and severe disease, etc. But remember, the mortality rate was primarily in the higher mortality rate was primarily in layers of the population that were, struggling with underlying diseases, comorbidities, immune suppression, etc. So the situation that I'm predicting would be much more severe, in the sense that I think that even early treatment would come too late, because it will really be a very fulminant, because of the resistance, because of the higher level of infectiousness, because of the virulence. So the lockdowns, I would not be surprised that they try to, lock up everybody, because if you don't know what to do, and if, obviously the vaccines don't work and the antivirals do no longer work, and what, you lock up people, you say, oh, you stay where you are, but the interesting thing is that I figured out that in the highly vaccinated countries, remember, all these highly vaccinated countries are experiencing the same problem, immune pressure put by the highly vaccinated population on the virus, but that is unable to tame the virus. So when the conditions in different countries are exactly the same for this virulent virus to emerge, you don't need this virus to spread. And it will not spread, because per definition, if a virus is highly virulent, that means, Stephen, that you get a lot of people who immediately get severe disease, who get hospitalized. These are not the people who are going to spread the virus. And certainly not the people who are dying are not going to spread the virus. But if the conditions in these different countries are the same, and as I was saying, for example, even if countries have, like, of course, if you have 90% vaccine coverage rate, and if you have, let's say, almost like exclusively used mRNA vaccines, and if you have not only boosted your people, but then given also a fourth and a fifth injection, in those countries it will go much faster. But in the others, it will simply follow, right? It will, it may be at a lower pace. The conditions are still the same. You are exerting, the population is exerting immune pressure on a virus that, is allowed to further evolve. There is plenty of proof to it. Remember, as I say, this is not a lie. In peer-reviewed publications, molecular epidemiologists are now qualifying the situation as being really alarming, right? So if you generate the same conditions, you will get the same outcome. So in other words, these virulent or highly virulent variants can develop independently in countries that are experiencing the same type of high-level immune pressure exerted by the population. You don't need this virus to spread anymore. That is very, very different from the situation that we have been experiencing in the past. And what
can a government do then?
Well, yeah, that is also something I'm describing in my book, because the question is, I always said, there is only one question to ask here. How is this circus going to end? Where is this going to end? I'm not interested in all this post hoc analysis where, people are saying, oh yeah, the virus became more infectious, become more resistant, etc. This has no added value for society. The only thing that has added value for society is predictions, and reliable predictions, predictions that are based on sound scientific grounds, because then you can prepare. The government is not prepared. I bet you that none of these health officials, including the WHO, is currently understanding what is going on. So you can imagine that even in this environment of not understanding what is going on, continuing to preach mass vaccination, right, and having millions of people involved in this program, I'm always saying, we scientists don't use these words very lightly, but this is criminal. There is no doubt about it, this is criminal. And they don't know what they are going to do. Right? And the attention gets now distracted by all kinds of different things, by wars, by, climate problems, but now also by avian influenza, where, now I read today in the New York Times, right, okay, avian flu is now becoming a threat. We should mass vaccinate people. And if the WHO should make sure we get enough vaccine to vaccinate people against avian flu, they should, they should consult with the rich countries, and especially also with the pharmaceutical industry, to make this happen. You see the dependence and the helplessness of these organizations that have steered all this, that have initiated all this. They don't know what to do, and they will not be able to solve the problem. We have simply pushed it too far. With Omicron, this has been a milestone. With Omicron, the situation has become irreversible. Omicron, because it is driving large-scale immune escape, it is driving acceleration of the immune escape, it is self-fueling the further evolution of the virus.
But is there somebody who understands the potential threat over there? Because it's your theory, and if they don't believe it, which is for the moment the case, then it's not criminal because they don't know. Or do you see it?
Well, I'm glad that you are making this comment, because in fact, the most important goal for me of writing a book, I mean, I'm not interested in writing a book or really commercializing this or saying, I'm part of history, I wrote a book, etc. But there is one thing, Steven. I wanted this to be documented with the best scientific evidence and insights that I had already in the past. I, like many other people, have learned a lot, because this is it's a little bit cynical to say this, but in terms of the science involved in this is just it is so rich, this phenomenon. It is, scientifically enormously challenging. So we have all learned a lot during this pandemic. So I have given, I think, the very best of myself to gather the scientific justification of my prediction, and everybody can challenge those. But what I wanted to do is to document this, to say, look, guys, because that is my conclusion, really. If there is one thing that was totally predictable based on scientific grounds, is that the mass vaccination would have very detrimental consequences. And rather than just saying this in an interview or, on a Substack or whatever, I wanted to gather and collect all these pieces of the puzzle that I've been using and that I'm presenting in my book, and that justify why I'm coming to these conclusions, regardless of any kind. I'm not at all into sensation. That people can challenge this, but at least, I have been doing this homework of collecting these pieces of the puzzle, and I come to these conclusions that for me are more than convincing. And so nobody will ever be able to say, oh, wait a minute, this was completely unprecedented, nobody could predict this. We have done the very best we could, we have developed antivirals, the best vaccine companies, etc. No. There's one thing mankind has forgotten about, and that is biology. And that is what my book tells very, very clearly. We have become, superstars in technologies, right? But we have forgotten about biology. We have completely ignored nature in this thing. We have been disturbing an equilibrium, a balance between the virus and the immune system. That is not just, the case for coronavirus. In general, these evolutions have been shaped over millions of years, this balance, to give the pathogen an opportunity to perpetuate without causing too much harm to the population. If you look at the population level, it's sad to say, if it's your dad, if this, good friend of yours, it's of course a catastrophe. But in fact, what a virus does during a natural pandemic is that it takes out of the population the weakest elements, right? My background is veterinary medicine. That is how we look at animal populations from an economical viewpoint, right? So, in fact, this is something which, you know, from the viewpoint of nature, keeps a sound balance between a population and certain pathogenic agents. You could say, why does the population need so pathogenic agents? Well, these pathogenic agents also help to stimulate the immunity of the population, etc. So it's very, very complex. It's very, very sophisticated. But this is something which is because it's shaped, you know, evolution picks the best, you know, solution, the solution that is, you know, that enables the contributors to survive, right? So this is very different from just developing a technology. I mean, any technology needs to be validated anyway by the rules of biology. You make an airplane, but you ignore the forces of gravity. Your airplane, your technology, forget about it. It needs to be validated by the rules of biology. Here, this aspect has been completely neglected. And if you look at the rules of immunology, virology, evolutionary biology, vaccinology, all these rules have been violated by mass vaccination. The principle of mass vaccination during a pandemic is violating all these rules, right? And I've been compiling all this evidence in, you know, as scientifically as possible, but looking at it from a holistic viewpoint, in the sense of, I'm not just looking at this from an immunological viewpoint, but also, you know, virological viewpoint, vaccinological viewpoint, evolutionary biology viewpoint, and even like biophysics. If we talk about interactions between the virus and antibodies and etc., it's all very, very complex. Just that people understand that this is a little bit more complex than the kind of nonsense that our health authorities and public health officials are trying to make people believe. You just get the jab and you don't worry, you'll be safe. And you know what? Best thing is that you vaccinate your children as well. And, you know, you will be good, right? This is, you know, I mean, if they read my book, I'm curious to see how they will think about the whole situation. I never go, you know, into the direction of conspiracy theories. But what I'm saying is that here we are dealing with a combination of arrogance and ignorance, which is very, very, very dangerous, especially if you use this as an arm against biology, right? And for me, there is no discussion that we will pay a huge price for this. But the good thing is, of course, that I think the impact on the population, on highly vaccinated populations, will be such that the future generation will be able to start from scratch again. They will have to build really from scratch, which is very, very tough. But we increasingly realize that so many layers of our society are now corrupted that I cannot say that I'm looking forward to this, but there is a need. There is a need that we rebuild society on new values. Integrity, dignity, a sense of community, and especially also humility. What we have seen, you know, all these interventions by the public health authority, WHO, industry, etc., it is just, you know, megalomania. Just thinking, we have the technologies, you know, we can control everything. And biology can be very insidious, and that is why people think now it's over. We have done good, we were smart, you know, we have done the mass vaccination, and look, people, you know, are no longer like dying from COVID-19, etc. They don't know, these idiots don't know what is happening, you know, underneath the surface of the water.
You have a lot of contact with a lot of worldwide top scientists. Do you have a lot of scientists who agree with your point of view?
You know, Steven, I'm kind of, you know, in all modesty, etc., I'm of course a little bit unique in my species, in a sense that I always told this, you know, I've made this decision like 12 years ago, where I was realizing that academia and even industry were not able to really bring solutions to complex health problems, because in academia they are just living in their ivory towers, just being obsessed with publications, because publications is the door, to climbing the ladder and to make, a career, to make, a fruitful career, let's say at university. And in industry, the competition is such that they throw products in their pipeline and in their clinical studies that they don't even know exactly how it works. Vaccinology is still very much an empirical business. And I got so fed up with this that I decided I would work on complex problems. I would not be the key expert in virology, nor in immunology, nor maybe in vaccinology, but I would be able to bring these pieces of the puzzle together. And if needed, I know that through hard work and through a certain intellectual capacity that we have as scientists, I can take a deep dive, even into the details, but I will only do so if I believe that doing so could bring a piece of the puzzle that is still missing, and that I could, that would help me to put this complex puzzle together. And that is simply something that so very few people are doing, because if you look at the key opinion leaders, at the superstars in academia, even at Nobel Prize winners, they are all so very specialized in their domain. Look, one of the biggest mistakes is that, when the pandemic started, they were saying, oh, this is a virus, so we need to have virologists on board. And look at all the crap and the nonsense that these leading virologists have been talking. It is just stunning. It's mind-blowing. And, immunologists were just barely involved. And again, those immunologists are then specifically, specialized in their field. What do they know about population immunity? What do they know about these interactions, this interplay between the virus and, the immune system, etc.? And it's not that I'm a genius. I had to learn this as well. But it's, if there is one thing that you cannot afford when you study these problems, and this has nothing to do with being a professor or a key opinion leader, etc., you ask the right questions. You continue to ask yourself the right questions. I don't need interviews, or I don't need people to ask me the questions. I know that I'm a very critical person, especially towards myself. So I ask myself all the time these questions, very challenging questions. And then there is one rule: never ever leave any stone unturned. If you cannot solve one of these questions, don't even proceed to the next step of your puzzle, because it will fire back. And so you have to to insist and to continue till you have really discovered the answers to your question. So it's a very particular pathway that I've chosen. I didn't make a lot of money choosing this pathway, but it is unique, and I think we need to rebuild, reform whole academic, education, because we are putting tons of money in all these institutions. And if you ask the question, what comes back to society? There is no return on the investment of society. Look, we have a pandemic, and, you see all these big stars being almost paralyzed by the situation, and then simply endorsing what WHO, it's like preaching, not based on any sound ground. And what industry is doing, industry which is, of course, not bothering about your health, Steve. They are bothering about enriching the shareholders, of course. That is their business plan. That is their business model. That is what they have to do, right? So therefore, unfortunately, there is very few peers that I can discuss this with at, kind of like the same level we are discussing. And it's maybe another effort of mine, or tentative to, write this book and expose this and offer this to people, because they can understand this, they have, you know, the baggage to understand this, and yeah, to share this in one way, in a way that I could not otherwise share this, because we don't get platforms where we can discuss this. We get censored all the time. We get ridiculed, and maybe a book is a better way to do this. But I say, as I told, my first goal was to document this, you know, that it would be carved in stone, that some people, you know, have been really taking a deep dive in this, analyzing this, trying to put a piece of the puzzle together. And the puzzle is, you know, on the cover of my book. Yeah, it's symbolic. It's putting the piece of the puzzle together, and that is a new way, I would say, for approaching and solving complex problems, which we unfortunately do not learn in academia, despite the fact that some of these universities have huge reputations. Yeah.
Is there still a small chance that your predictions, according to you, will not that it will not be the case, not be that worse as you imagine?
Of course, I mean, of course it's possible. All I can do is that I bring the biological evidence together, and I think, I know you have not a background in life science, but you will understand that there is one thing I'm sure you will admit after, because I know that you have also been, you know, involved in this since quite some time, that this problem is very complex. It's a complex interplay, and it is evolving. You know, when the definitions got changed of what is a vaccine, what is immunity, when are you vaccinated, not after 2 weeks after second shot, and all these things were the definition were continuously evolving. That was just reflecting how the virus was evolving. Imagine. Because the thing that they had expected was no longer working, like with a normal vaccine. After 2 doses, you're completely protected, and you could even protect against infection, etc. Was no longer, so they had to change definition. The virus evolved, right? And so they had to change the definitions to continue to make people believe that the vaccines were effective. So it's a complex interplay. It is evolving. It draws from different fields, even from biophysics, immunology, vaccinology, evolutionary biology, etc. Right? So you can imagine that that there is not 23 ways to put the pieces of a complex puzzle together. And I could be lying with myself and say, I find all the pieces of the puzzle. I can tell you, all the pieces of the puzzle that I'm putting together, if it is a piece of the puzzle of immunology, it needs to comply also with the other fields. It cannot violate the roles of the other fields. An immunologist could say this, and I would say no. The virus would not do this for this or this reason. Or a virologist would say, the virus has this kind of strategy. And I would immediately say, you know what? A virus has no brains. All what a virus can do, virus has no strategy. All what a virus can do is replicate and mutate, right? And nature will select mutations that are favorable or not favorable, dependent on how the immune system is reacting, for example. See? So all this need to comply with each other. So I continue to say that the likelihood that you put pieces of the puzzle together in a way that is scientifically plausible and justifiable, there is no 25 or 23 or even 3 different ways to do this. So could I be wrong theoretically? Of course, I'm certainly not God. I can only say I've taken a deep, deep dive in this. I already had this multidisciplinary culture for the science before. I've been deeply involved also in the Ebola crisis, where WHO made the huge mistake of vaccinating people during the incubation time, because they started vaccinated people who had a contact with the index case. The index case is the first case that you detect, and then there is contacts, ring vaccination. They started to vaccinate all people who had contact with this index case. not realizing that some of these people, because they had been in contact, were already incubating the disease. There is one like textbook recommendation: never ever vaccinate people that are in the incubation time of a disease. So that was a huge mistake that I already perceived and analyzed. Guess what? They are making another capital mistake, a textbook mistake almost. Instead of vaccinating people in the incubation time, they now vaccinate massively people during a pandemic, which is a context that we vaccinologists are never using for vaccination. Our vaccines can only protect people if we do it in a prophylactic context. If you vaccinate people and allow them to build full-fledged immunity before they get exposed to the virus or to the pathogen. That's why if you go, I gave this example multiple times, you go to a country where there is an infectious disease that is vaccine preventable, you will make sure your vaccination is completely finished before you go to that country, right?
Do you have an example?
Yeah, well, I mean, all the vaccinations that you take, cholera, etc., for example, when you go, or even, hepatitis B, for example, you start working in a hospital, people will say, what's your titer for hepatitis B antibodies? Oh, it's too low, or you never got vaccinated. You first got vaccinated. Then people test your titer, neutralizing antibodies. Okay, you are above the threshold, you can go, right? I mean, these are key principles that are violated.
Because all those vaccines, you are a big fan of them.
Well, a big fan of course. I mean, I'm not saying that there is not a trend to over-vaccination. I'm the first to review and to revisit this. But if we talk about, and again, look at all the childhood vaccines. The childhood vaccines work, and they have saved millions of lives. There's no discussion about this. But if you look, these are live attenuated vaccines. So what they do far and foremost is that they stimulate our innate immune system. I mean, why do you think that we are still, 2023, using live attenuated vaccines, a technology that is very complex? You can imagine that your whole manufacturing process, your development, you're working with living viruses. You need to attenuate them, not too much because then they don't work anymore. If you don't attenuate them sufficiently, of course, you are injecting the disease in people. So, and also from a safety viewpoint, to the security viewpoint, it's complex, these technologies, right? It's like very old-fashioned technologies. Still, despite all the modern, technologies that are being developed, mRNA, vectorized vaccines, etc., DNA vaccines, we are still using these live attenuated vaccines for our children. The reason is that they stimulate very strongly innate immunity. I'm the first to say that there is room for improvement because, of course, if you use this live attenuated vaccine in a child that has an underlying disease or genetically, for example, weak immune system, this live attenuated vaccine can break through and become virulent. So have there been casualties as a consequence of the childhood? For sure. On the other hand, have the childhood vaccinations allowed to fill up the gaps in herd immunity in populations that are, for example, exposed to measles, etc.? Certainly. If you don't do this, you can have a whole layer of, the newborns, for example. They have not been exposed to young children, and they can be, of course, they build a very susceptible part of the population because they have no immunity, right? So if we don't immunize them and close the gap of herd immunity, we are at risk of having major outbreaks. There is no discussion about it. But again, you hear me talking a lot about immunology, a field that is, and about innate natural immunity is completely neglected and ignored. Of course, you don't hear me saying that, we don't need to look for vaccines against TB or HIV or malaria. These are like chronic diseases. chronic diseases can, per definition, they are chronic, they are not acute self-limiting. They cannot spontaneously be cured by your natural immunity. It's almost like the definition of it. But here we are dealing with acute self-limiting infections. That is also the reason why a pandemic of a virus causing acute self-limiting infection will also be self-limiting. A pandemic has these few waves and then it comes to an end, because it is tamed by natural immunity, and natural immunity at the population level will generate herd immunity, which prevents the transmission of the virus and allows the virus to transition into endemicity, right?
Well, I think that was, it's really interesting. Then maybe what can you advise the people who took the vaccine against COVID? Because if you're right, they are in big troubles. Can they do something? Well,
I've also described in my book very clearly that, of course, not all we cannot put all vaccinees in the same basket. And some vaccinees will, despite a vaccination, be protected. Still, we need to distinguish, of course, between, as I have already been saying, people who have been vaccinated with mRNA vaccines. We also need to take into account how many doses people have gotten. And very importantly, we also need to see who has been exposed to natural infection before being vaccinated.
Why is that important?
Well, this is because people, by having been previously exposed to natural infection, they can develop some kind of course of natural immunity that will, help to protect them. Whereas as soon as you start vaccination, especially with the mRNA vaccines, it's also explained in my book how you sideline the innate immune system. So the innate immune system has no longer an opportunity to be trained. So then you can imagine these people have to completely rely on the vaccinal antibodies. When those don't work anymore, I thought, that is the end. No, there are still non-neutralizing antibodies that are generated in people that have neutralizing antibodies that do no longer work. It's complex. So these are now protecting, as I was saying, on a provisional basis, the unvaccinated. But to your point, I mean, having been exposed to natural infection before the vaccination has, under a number of circumstances, an advantage. It all depends on how many vaccinations you got afterwards, all depends on whether you were subsequently vaccinated with non-mRNA vaccines or with mRNA vaccines. So it's not like, typically in biology, it's not like it's black or white, right? And I'm summarizing in my book categories of people who got vaccinated that will certainly still be protected. This is not to say that all the others will not be protected, but you need to be very careful. Based on my understanding of immunology, virology, I wanted to make sure that if I put something in writing, that it is accurate and that I'm not kind of like saying, these people, despite being vaccinated, will all be protected, and I would not be 200% certain. What will happen to the others, it's more difficult. But for me, there is no doubt, Steve, that having thrown a bombshell on this natural equilibrium shaped over millions of years by evolution, that nature will reestablish this, but it will come at a price. And it will come at, according to my humble opinion, a huge toll on human lives in highly vaccinated countries.
And what can you advise everybody then? Because you are expecting a major crisis. How can we prepare ourselves if you are right?
Well, for the unvaccinated, as I was saying, health-wise, I don't see any problem, right? If they are in good health and they have been exposed, which is automatically almost the case for everyone. What I'm very worried about is the chaos that will be generated, a chaos that will be initiated when waves of severe disease, accelerated severe disease, I call it enhanced severe disease, will start, where hospitals will be overwhelmed. This will certainly generate chaos. How we will manage this, frankly speaking, I don't know. It's something that is completely unprecedented, and you could say, well, Geert, this is so unreal. But if there is one thing that we, people who have been criticizing this, feel as really unreal, it's the fact that health authorities took the decision to mass vaccinate people, millions of people with an experimental vaccine. And this vaccine, this was completely predictable, is now driving the virus to change. We call this its phenotype. The phenotype is the way it behaves in terms of its infectious behavior, the virulence, the way it is transmitted. So I'm saying, what is unreal? Because people are looking at me, Geert, what are you predicting? And I'm saying, look at what health authorities have been doing. They have set up the biggest gain of function experiment ever. It's not a gain of function, in the lab of Wuhan or whatever. The gain of function is when you do a massive experiment in vivo on the very human species that is driving a dramatic change in the phenotype, in the functional behavior of the virus, that I'm saying is now at high risk of evolving to a more virulent form of the virus. I mean, Steven, this is just unbelievable. This kind of experiment, a mass experiment on the human species, that is the most unbelievable gain of function experiment ever conducted in the history of biology. And then, frankly speaking, don't be surprised that this will have massive consequences. I'm afraid. I hate to be the doom and gloom preacher. I hate this. But, if I put all the scientific arguments together, and I'm not at all surprised, this is completely aligned to my predictions, is that now we have this kind of like silence, calm before the storm. Again, why the subtitle of my book is, society will be caught by surprise.
And what was because we did not discuss it yet, what was the title? Now you mentioned the subtitle.
Well, yeah, the title is The Inescapable Immune Escape Pandemic. Yes, I should have explained this. We discussed it before our interview, therefore. But so a natural pandemic does not breed immune escape variants. Of course, a natural pandemic, virus replicates, depending on what type of virus it is, flu or other mRNA viruses, will of course be prone to generate mutants, variants. That is always the case. But as a matter of fact, during a natural pandemic, it has never been seen that one of these variants that happened to pop up during the replication of the virus was able to supplant the variant or the strain that initiated the pandemic. Now we have seen, of course, after the mass vaccination, we saw that Beta, Gamma, Delta, Omicron became dominant, right? In countries where mass vaccination proceeded, vaccinated large parts of the population, we had all of a sudden, the original strain, the Wuhan, was supplanted by variants. And then those were supplanted by other more infectious variants, right? This, we have never seen this before. So that means that we are no longer dealing with a natural pandemic. We are dealing with a pandemic of immune escape variants. A pandemic of immune escape variants has never been described. It's completely unprecedented.
And that's
so
also
that already
is that also the reason why in Africa there are almost no problems in the countries where almost nobody was vaccinated, or is it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the key word here is herd immunity. If you allow a population to develop herd immunity, just this morning I looked at the curves for Africa. You see, there have been a number of waves. And now, in contrast to our Western European countries, the industrialized countries, they are back to the baseline, just like a natural pandemic, right? You have the waves, high infection rate, and after the infection rate, you go back to zero. You can have another wave, but, after a few waves, it calms down and you go back to the baseline. That is not the case. In our countries, we have seen several different waves, very irregular, never turn back to the baseline, and they started again the next wave, right? Very irregular. So an immune escape pandemic is already an unnatural phenomenon. This already suggests that there has been a major intervention into this natural phenomenon. And then, as I explained, with Omicron, this evolution of enhanced immune escape has become irreversible. I explained how through vaccine breakthrough infections, the immune escape became worse, became expedited, became, large-scale immune escape. So that I said, when Omicron appeared, I said immediately, even if we stop mass vaccination all over the world today, we are no longer going to be able to stop this immune escape evolution. Of course, in the countries that continue to mass vaccinate, that continue to give the boosters, that even included the children, it would go even faster. But the evolution towards, a more virulent form of the virus would be inescapable. Therefore, the title, Inescapable Immune Escape Pandemic. A type of pandemic that has never been seen, documented, occurred in the past.
Okay. And then the new book is available, your first book, is available on your website.
Well, we will, of course, announce it on the website, but we will make sure that it is available through, bol.com, usual channel in Europe, and then in the US through Amazon. We have, two different editors, one in the Netherlands, Paris Publications, and in the US, Pierucci Publications, who will help us. The book is in print as we speak, and they will help us, of course, to distribute this. And we will certainly also announce this through very different platforms. The platforms we have been communicating through, during this crisis, and the platforms that we have used to warn people, to make the information available. Several different of these platforms will help us to
should read the book, because it's quite hard. You have
it's a hard copy and an electronic copy.
The content is not that easy.
No.
It's you have to have a little bit of scientific background, I assume, or can everyone read it?
Well, there is like the prologue where I'm describing why I wrote this book, why I did this, right? I never had the intention to do this, but there is, of course, also the endorsements from several different people. There is the summary, there are the conclusions, it is also my position towards, without, I do this, I think, in a very diplomatic way, how I'm evaluating the decisions and the reaction of regulatory authorities, health authorities, WHO, etc. So these are chapters that any, lay people will understand. But several of the other chapters will be much more difficult for people to understand. Although I think even if you read through this without understanding everything, even understanding maybe 20% of these more difficult, more scientific chapters, I think people will get a good understanding of the real complexity of this. and the hypocritical attitude of our health authorities and WHO, and making people believe that this is so easy and that the vaccines are so protective, and that there is only one key message they should keep in mind, which is to get vaccinated, to get their updated boosters, and to get children vaccinated, etc. So this complexity anybody will grasp. But remember, the main goal of this book is to document this with a scientific approach that is very different from the one you will see in publications. But nevertheless, I've cited many, many references. These references are not proof in their own right. They're all pieces of the puzzle, and I help the reader on the journey to bring these pieces of the puzzle together. So I hope it will be very valuable for the scientific community. And I think for lay people, it will nevertheless be a unique piece of literature, because I don't think, in all modesty, I wish other people would also do this, that I'm highlighting a number of aspects of this pandemic that nobody has been highlighting, like the immunology, like the natural, the incredible importance of our natural immunity, that can be trained, and that is so much more powerful, especially during a pandemic, because it can generate what we call sterilizing immunity. Yeah. That is what you need. You need to be able to eliminate the virus, which the vaccinal antibodies cannot do. So there is, and also why the mRNA vaccines are so much more detrimental in terms of undermining the natural immunity, also in terms of expediting the immune escape. Even if people don't understand the molecular details of this, I think they will get a very good understanding, and at least they will certainly understand that in reality this is much, much more complex. This is even so complex that every layman will understand that it has been a shame that people who don't understand this are intervening at a massive level and using the human population really as guinea pigs, right? So yeah, so it is. It's not going to be the Harry Potter bestseller. That it's also not my purpose, right? But for those who want to understand a little bit what is behind all this and why, because my book is very often structured. It starts from questions that people are asking. Why is this? Why? So many questions that we didn't get any satisfactory answer to. These are for me the stones that I don't leave unturned. Oh. When these questions come, you have to try to find an answer. And to find that answer, you cannot just pick one piece of the puzzle. You first have to put the piece of the puzzle together. Then you can find answers to many, many questions. So it is a lot of reacting to questions. So or statements that are made. You make statements, and then I'm developing the science around this or the science behind this. So yeah, I hope that nevertheless for laymen it will have some added value as well. But yeah,
So it is now your first book. You're 64 years old. What are your plans for the next years? A second book, or will you now enjoy your life and family?
I will. I cannot predict these things, and doing if nothing is going to happen, nothing abnormal is going to happen. So I'm not panicking, but I'm certainly preparing myself and my family for what I think is going to happen in highly vaccinated countries, the chaos, right? And I think there is an increasing awareness amongst people that we have to get back to some key values that helped us to build sound societies in the past, that have helped us to flourish as, as nations, as societies. And these are very much, the values that also somebody like Robert Malone is, advocating for, like dignity and integrity, a sense of community, solidarity, voice for science and solidarity. We need to learn again that in terms of crisis, we can overcome this, provided we keep together and we try to do things together. We do not have to rely on the services provided by the government and all these type of things, because those may crash, right? We have to learn this again. I'm always saying solidarity helps you to overcome a crisis. It's not going to help you to make an economy flourish, but to overcome a crisis. So that is what I will be myself focusing on. And I will, of course, remain available to provide help and advice where I can. But it's a little bit sad to say, in my humble opinion, it's now really left to nature to restore this balance. And that's why I'm saying I want to be prepared to the extent possible, without panicking, without being obsessed. A pandemic is always a crisis. It's just that by wrongly manipulating it, we have made it much, much worse. It just, we don't realize. The bulk of the iceberg is under the water, as I was saying, but it will surface one day. And there, we need to be prepared. But I don't have any, magic or silver bullet to say people, that is what you need to do. Sometimes I'm saying, maybe we should go to Bulgaria, a country low vaccination rate. So if things happen, these societies will not crash.
But for the moment, you're staying in Belgium, or?
Yeah, well, if I would not, have probably, it's very often because of family. It's difficult. It's difficult to do this, certainly at my age. But if I were, for example, 25, would not have all these engagements, I think I would do it. I think
go to Bulgaria or Africa, or
no. But remember, Africa. How do you get to Africa?
No, you can go there before.
No, you could still go.
No.
But even for me, don't misunderstand me. Even for me, it's difficult to believe what I'm predicting. It's difficult. And sometimes I'm hesitating. And then I read for the proofreading of the book, and I always come to these conclusions that this is so compelling. It is so compelling that for me there is no way around it. But even for myself, it's difficult to believe this. So it would be ideal when these things start to happen, because some countries will take the lead, unfortunately. I'm thinking of countries like Israel, for example, or Great Britain, or even the US. They have been very aggressively vaccinating their populations. They have been vaccinating, huge amounts of people within a very short time frame. And then, like in Israel, it's primarily mRNA vaccines, etc. You can imagine the more you vaccinate people within a short time frame, the higher the pressure. The pressure comes from the population.
But is the vaccination rate in, for instance, Belgium not higher than in the United States?
But the vaccination rate in itself is not that important. It's important, of course, but it's essentially the speed at which you vaccinate. Before people could even get, exposed to natural infection, for example. Plus, if you vaccinate a high amount of people within a short time frame, you generate a high pressure. The pressure comes from the population. Wow. If you vaccinate like 5% of the population, like in Africa, or 10%, it has barely an influence on the evolution of the virus. If now you pass on the virus to me, to anybody else, and they're all vaccinated, the virus is every single time under the same unfavorable condition. And a variant that you pass on to me will, again, have a competitive advantage in my environment because I'm also vaccinated, right? If that is not the case, if there's only 5 or 10% of the population vaccinated, the likelihood that somebody passes on a virus to somebody who's not vaccinated is very much higher. In that person, the variant that got selected in your body will no longer have a competitive advantage in my body. See, so that is an important factor. So, but what I was saying, if you see this happening, and then you decide to make a move, it's no longer going to be possible, because if we're talking about chaos, first things, you know, ships, planes, etc., will be paralyzed. So it will be, you will need to do this over land. But yeah, so I try to stay objective and kind of like, yeah, not cool, but panic is always.
But do you have extra food at your basement?
Yeah, but you know, I don't think that will be the major problem. I'm essentially thinking of, you know, the healthcare crashing, because remember, I mean, we all more than we think rely on healthcare, on doctors, on hospitals, on even a small accident could be a major problem. And then I'm also very worried about maybe high mortality rates. That's what will happen to these corpses, for example, right? Who will remove them? Who will, you know, take care of this? And that is, yeah, something I'm really worried about. As I was saying, it's yeah. Sometimes I'm also thinking here, what you're telling is unreal. But look, I mean, if you look at the book and you will see that all this evidence is pushing into the same direction. And it is a phenomenon. I'm also citing that example. These things have happened before in the space of animal viruses. That a virus that became much more infectious, and there is this saying, which is complete nonsense, that the virus becomes more infectious and therefore it will lose virulence, it will become milder. Now, that is a completely wrong interpretation. That is what happens during a natural pandemic, because, you know, you have an infectious virus, it spreads, population develops herd immunity, and that is what tames the virus. But there are examples of, especially with avian influenza, where the virus became more infectious and where this higher level of infectiousness led to a higher level of virulence. It's also described that this happened due to a higher level of fusogenicity of the hemagglutinin, which is the equivalent of the spike protein in coronavirus. And also, you know, the fusogenicity is what is analyzed in vitro as a criterion, as a correlate for virulence. So we know that viruses circulating right now in vitro are already more virulent based on fusogenicity. But in vivo, because the vaccinees still have these non-neutralizing antibodies that protect them from severe disease, this virulence doesn't come, you know, is not expressed right now, if you like. But if the virus will overcome this antibody resistance, which you don't have in vitro in the test tube, yeah, then we have the same situation. But I mean, this evolution towards a higher level of fusogenicity, this means fusogenicity that cells that are infected can fuse and they build syncytia. These are these big cells. When several different cells merge, you have different nuclei within one big cell. And this is pathognomonic for severe disease. So people who are looking at you know, corpses of people who died from severe COVID-19 disease. That is what they typically see in the organs, the syncytia that have been built. So therefore they are pathognomonic for severe disease, and they are the result of enhanced fusogenicity of the virus, which correlates with a higher level of virulence. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm still hoping that you too, of course, that you're not right.
Yeah.
Then I think we had a good discussion. I think people who are interested to buy your book can find the way to Amazon or bol.com or to your website to order it. Do you still have a last message that you want to share with our viewers and or listeners?
Well, the message I would like to share is that there is certainly at no point, I said this from the very, very beginning, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever, and there has never been any reason whatsoever for, you know, vaccinees and non-vaccinated to discriminate. one another. So there is no reason to avoid contact or whatever. I think, on the contrary, we need to do whatever we can to help each other. And I would also like to refer to something that Matthias de Smet is very often saying. We need to be very cautious, very careful that we don't start this mass formation amongst our group of the unvaccinated, so to say. So I think solidarity is so important, not discriminate, and we will go through a big crisis. I mean, for me, there is no doubt about this, but the key message is that we need to do the best we can to help each other. And I don't know, maybe governments will realize soon enough that we have to distribute massively antivirals, like ivermectin, to people, and get rid of all the taboos around this, to prevent
only the vaccinated?
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. I mean, the unvaccinated
don't need it.
This will be recorded. This will be. I've said this at a big meeting recently at Stockholm. Said, this gets recorded. I am saying that the unvaccinated will no longer suffer, regardless of how the virus evolves. Right. This balance has been completely changed. Initially, the vaccinated were better protected against disease, etc. Now they are still protected, but this protection is not robust. It's now the unvaccinated that, thanks to their trained immunity, are developing very robust infection, regardless of the variant. And I think we are already seeing this, that more and more unvaccinated who got regularly exposed and who are very much engaged in society, that in fact they most of them don't even develop any symptoms anymore. So, So, but the key message is, I think, like the website says, stick to the science and to solidarity. And we'll face a big crisis, but we need to join our forces to do the best we can to limit the damage.
No, that's a difficult message, but also I think it's good that you pinpoint the fact that there's too much polarization, and we have to stop that, because everyone will, if you are right, need each other if the crisis would emerge.
Absolutely.
No, thank you, Geert, for this again. Interesting, maybe not so positive, but nevertheless interesting chat, talk. Thanks for coming to Compleetdenkers. We did this interview today in English, since your book is in English, of course. Hopefully it was not too difficult for too many people, but even in Dutch it would be. It is a very complex topic, but I'm happy that you came over, and thanks for coming. And I hope that your book, although you don't want to have a bestseller, I still hope for you that a lot of people read it, because I think even if you're not right, there's a lot of interesting data that needs to be understood for the future, because even if you're not right, it is clear that a lot of errors were made last year's scientific errors. Even for me, it is quite clear, and I have no medical or scientific background, and we have to learn for the future.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Steven, for inviting me again, and thanks also for helping to spread the word. That is also, of course, very important. And as I was saying, we'll see what happens. But let's try to, make in some ways humanity great again and hold together, and try to go through this crisis, if it happens, together. Yeah, thank you as well.
Thank you, Geert. And also thank you, dear listeners and or viewers, to have listened or watched our episode with Geert Vanden Bossche. On our website, you can find all our other episodes, mostly in Dutch. And you also can find there ways to support us in order that we can make more content as today. If you liked this episode, please share it with your friends and family and or environment. And I hope to see you for a next episode. Thank you.